Hello there. My name is Vladimir Miletic, and I am a psychotherapist, a psychotherapy supervisor, and a lecturer. I teach and supervise young constructivist psychotherapists. Uh, specifically the brand of constructivism that I am involved with is called personal construct psychology. That's clearly going to be the subject of this lecture. The title says that it's going to be the shortest possible introduction, and I'm not known as a concise person, but I will do my best. And just keep in mind that constructivism is very complex and very comprehensive. It's a very big field. So we will talk about the bare bones kind of constructivism. So only the most important concepts. By no stretch of imagination will you be an expert in constructivism, but you will hopefully have a good idea about what constructivism is, what makes it so special, at least for me, and how constructivist therapy broadly operates. If this slide would change, okay, here it is. These are some of the topics I will be discussing today. So we'll talk about the theoretical pillars of constructivist theory, about the significance of relationships. We will talk about constructs. Since the word is constructivist, you can't really go without talking about constructs. We will talk about change, diagnosis, and disorder, and how we approach these things from a constructivist point of view. And then we will address topics like transference, countertransference, and resistance, because they hold a central place in psychoanalysis, in constructivism, much like they do in psychoanalysis. However, the way that we deal with them is quite different. And my unbiased, completely objective opinion, better. But clearly, since I'm a constructivist, I have to say that. So this is what you will learn in this lecture today. Questions are always welcome. If you're watching the recording of this lecture, you can email me your question, leave the question in the comments section, whatever works for you. I'm very sloppy when it comes to responding to emails, but when it comes to spreading the good word and teaching people about constructivism, I am very diligent. So don't be afraid to ask. So constructivism has been around for around 70 years. George Kelly, this guy on the right, is the founder of contemporary constructivism. And he published a 2-volume book called The Psychology of Personal Constructs in 1955, although his theory has been around for about a decade more, because at the time when he published his book, he already had students that were practicing as constructivists. So his idea, when he was writing and inventing his theory, was to create a language to talk about human beings that would basically do away with the dominant psychological language of his time. And that was psychoanalysis or behaviorism. Kelly wasn't very fond of either, although he did have immense respect for psychoanalysis. But his idea was that both of these theories tend to take human beings who have these very unique lives, these very authentic, special experiences, and then cram them into certain concepts. And he felt like neither of these two theories did justice to the complexity of individuals as he encountered them. So he created a theory that would operate as a meta theory. This means that constructivism doesn't offer any prescriptions, any ideas such as irrational thinking or defense mechanisms. Constructivism is a tool that helps you understand how every person sees the world, how they define their problems, and help them find solutions that make sense for them. So instead of throwing a theoretical framework onto a person. Constructivism was created so that you understand and explicate, so that you clarify the already existing psychological world and then work within that paradigm. It's a highly, highly individualistic form of psychotherapy. Constructivism was built in a very mathematical way, and I mean this in the best possible way because Kelly was a mathematician and an engineer who then went on to become a psychotherapist and a psychologist. But he created the theory much like Euclidean geometry. So you have certain axioms and then you build on them. It was done so that you can learn the theory in a very logical and transparent way. And this is both good and bad. I think it's good because it allows us to understand this very complicated theory in a simpler way. But it's bad because people usually read those two books and then come away with this very mistaken notion that they're dealing with a cognitive theory. Constructivism is much, much, much more than that. And you'll see even in reputable textbooks that Kelly is presented as a cognitive psychologist. That is just inaccurate. Constructivism is older than cognitive psychology and much more complex. The very foundation of constructivist thinking is a philosophy called constructive alternativism. The idea is quite simple, even though the name sounds complicated, which is that everything that we encounter in life, every person, every event, everything, can be construed in infinitely many ways. So there's no one way in which things exist. That doesn't mean, I have to say, that every construction is valid. Constructions of the world are always tested when we interact with the world. There are infinitely many of them. We can say that infinitely many are valid and they work, but infinitely many also don't. Because when people read this statement, what constructive alternativism is, their takeaway seems to be that we can just see ourselves however we like, reality be damned. That is, for better or worse, not true. Constructivism is not relativism. This is very important to underline because it is a frequent and inaccurate critique of constructivism. As Richard Rorty said, as far as he knows, and Rorty is one of the great philosophers of our time, so let's assume that he knows, no one actually is a relativist. Constructivism is very clear about the fact that there is an external world. The only epistemological position of constructivism, so our theory of knowledge, is that we can never really know what this world is. We can tell different stories about the world, but we can never see it from an objective point of view. You can see things only through your own eyes, right? You can't really see things from nowhere. You cannot leave your own eyes and see things from the side. And even if you somehow magically do, you're still seeing the world with some other pair of eyes. So in that sense, we know that whatever we see in the world, it's really just what our experience and culture tell us that there is to be seen in the world. We don't believe that there is such a thing as correspondence with reality. So we're not relativists, but we do say that you kind of have to live with this idea that you never entirely know if things are true. We'll come back to that a little later. I think this can be a very upsetting idea to some, but also a very liberating idea. So let's consider the four theoretical pillars of constructivist thinking. And when I said a second ago, we'll talk about that a little later, I meant really literally here on this slide. So the four main themes of constructivism are anticipation, relationality, process, and agency. Anticipation means that the nature of our psychological processes, so the psychological side of our being, exists by anticipating events. So we always try to predict future events. We base these predictions on our past experiences. So we take the stories that we told ourselves about our past and use those stories to anticipate the future. If someone has hurt you immensely, let's say you were abandoned by a parent, for example, right? So that's a very painful, formative experience. And then as you go through the world, this experience becomes important when someone comes as close to you as your parents did, right? And then let's say you meet someone you like, you meet a partner. And then what happens is that you anticipate something like the pain you experienced in the past. And then this anticipation affects how you participate in that relationship. Perhaps you will keep your distance to prevent being hurt too much, right? So that's what it means anticipatory, right? So all the thoughts that we have, all the feelings that we have, the entire psychological structure that we have is kind of geared towards anticipating events. From a constructivist point of view, we're kind of sadly stuck between the past and the future in the sense that we can't really rid ourselves of both. The past supplies us with anticipations that we then project on to the future, right? But that also means that all the knowledge that we have is hypothetical. It's anticipatory. The function of knowledge is to give meaning to the world so that we can better find a place for ourselves and so that we can adjust to the world and change the world to suit our needs. So when a constructivist goes about his or her life, what they usually keep in mind is that everything that they think or feel may really not be true. Right? We have to act in the world as constructivists, all the while knowing that everything we know about the world could very well be completely false. So it's a kind of strange position, similar to what Richard Rorty would call ironism, basically, where you have to act, but you know that you're acting based on your assumptions. And I know that this may seem anxiety-inducing to some, but personally, I find this to be very liberating because I can live in the world and know that it's okay if I'm proven wrong, that it's really not the end of the world. And if the world starts suddenly changing, I know that this is really just an invitation for me to get creative and create new anticipations. I don't have to be burdened by the weight of the world this way. The second theoretical pillar is relationality, meaning that everything that exists through relationships. This is where, in its more philosophical aspect, constructivism really approaches what the Buddhists call dependent origination. So everything that exists in a relationship with something else. But because this is supposed to be focused on the psychological side of things, let's stick to who we are. Our personality doesn't exist in a vacuum. It's co-created through relationships. Basically, what this means is that everything that's within, all the stories that we tell ourselves about ourselves, our identities, the way we talk, the way we dress, the way we move, before it kind of ended up inside of us, it was in between us and other people. This is really very easy to understand on a practical, down-to-earth level. Let's maybe expand the example that I just gave you a second ago. Let's say a person was abandoned by a parent, and then they meet someone that they really, really like. They fall in love with someone, right? Oh, the horror. So this person now anticipates that they will be hurt again, the same way they were hurt in the past, right? Because the story that they told themselves is perhaps something like love hurts, or everyone abandons you in the end. So this person starts a relationship with that set of assumptions about relationships, that they don't last very long, that they necessarily involve a lot of pain and a lot of hurt. So what does this person do? this person is going to protect themselves because this person is not a masochist and they don't want to expose themselves to more pain than necessary. So I fear that I might be hurt. So I keep my distance in a relationship. The person that I'm with notices this distance and says, I'm not really sure if this person actually likes me, if this Vladimir is in love with me or not, because I see that he's kind of withdrawing from me. He's becoming more distant, right? So if someone is becoming that way with you, you can try to come a little closer, but a person who anticipates hurt and pain will move back, take a step back, right? And then when this happens several times, you're going to say, well, if this person keeps pulling back, I'm also going to pull back. And when this person who believes that relationships end in abandonment, when they see their partner moving back, they immediately say, there it is. There it is. I'm being left now. I'm being abandoned. I'm being rejected. And so they might break up the relationship or throw a tantrum, and then the other person might break up a relationship. And when that happens, the person confirms that yes, intimacy is pain and relationships are doomed. You see how that operates? We always validate or invalidate our identity through relationships. That's how we come up with these stories that we call identities. The third pillar is process. So in constructivism, we see the whole world as a kind of movement. Kelly writes in the beginning of his Psychology of Personal Constructs that everything in the world is constantly moving, but that at the same time, the whole universe is integral. So everything is connected. And that means that if one thing is changing, everything else has to change. So the entire world is a process. Because we are a part of the world, we are also a process. So this establishes constructivism as a psychodynamic theory. If the function of our psyche is to create anticipations, right, to kind of try to give meaning to the world, then our psyche can never stand still because the world always changes. So what was true yesterday may not be true tomorrow about us and about other people. So we see a person as a kind of movement, or as Kelly says, person is a form of motion. So nothing ever stands still from a constructivist point of view. The reason why we feel like we're the same people today as we were yesterday or 2 years ago is because not everything changes at the same pace. Some things change very, very slow. When something is a matter of our identity, the change is usually very slow. The fourth pillar is agency. Everything that a person does is a kind of a choice. When it comes to agency and anticipation, we can really say that constructivism firmly stands in the group of existentialist theories. Existentialists like Sartre, for example, believe that we are condemned, as he says, to be free, but that also means that we must make choices all the time. And that means that we are responsible for every single choice that we make, even when the circumstances we find ourselves in are, well, crappy, as that often happens. But agency is always at our core. Choices that we make are not necessarily easy to articulate verbally. Sometimes we don't really understand them consciously. But every movement, every gesture we make is a choice of some kind. So the point of this is not to say everything that happens to you is your fault, because clearly it isn't, right? People find themselves born in poverty, for example, and you can hardly blame them for that. They are, however, responsible to deal with this facticity, with this state of things, as the world appears to them, may not be their doing. However, their response to the world is always their choice. Our choices shape us because we are relational beings who always anticipate events in a world that is very dynamic. That means that every choice we make changes us, it changes our constructs, but that means that in turn, it changes the world for us. So, no, the point is not to say that we should blame ourselves for every symptom we may have or every difficult situation that we find ourselves in. But we can say with certainty from a constructivist perspective that we are always responsible for the choices that we make, but those choices are not necessarily conscious. So we said that constructivism is a relational theory. This work by Escher that you see here on the screen illustrates how relationality works. If the concept is confusing to you, just take a look at this image, and that's all you need to know. Everything's contained here. We are always very entangled. I can't think of myself as good or bad or anything really without other people. Right? It's a kind of dialectic in a sense. For me to be good, someone has to be bad. Someone somewhere, right? Okay, so our entire personality is a consequence of interactions like the one that's illustrated on this image here. As long as we are in relationships, and we are in relationships even when we sit alone in our room, because other people are implicitly present, because the results of previous relationships live within us. So we can't escape other people as much as God knows we all want to sometimes. So there are two types of relationships in constructivism, and here I mean interpersonal relationships. We have dependency relationships and role relationships. We all start off from dependency relationships. So this is a very basic fact of life for all of us. We all have psychological and other needs from the moment that we're born. As soon as we find ourselves, as Heidegger would say, thrown into this world, we have some needs. We're hungry, we're thirsty, we need comfort, we need love. The number of needs is really infinite. In standard psychological theories, we tend to think of babies and children as being quite dependent. And then most psychological theories talk about humans becoming more independent as they grow up. For us in constructivism, this is an illusion. This is an illusion, and it's not, for us at least, it's not true. The idea, and Kelly is very explicit about this, is that adults actually depend even more on their surroundings. But because we have more needs, our lives are far more complex than lives of infants. Just take a look at where we are now. We're having this lecture online. And you need the internet, you need some peace and quiet to be able to listen to it. You need me, I need you. Otherwise, what on earth is this? So all these are kind of needs. Internet is a need. Having a house is a need. Having a car is a need, depending on where you live and so on. So we have a lot of dependencies. Only, Kelly says, our dependencies as adults are dispersed. So if you need to complain to someone so that you feel understood, you'll likely have more than one friend, right? A baby, however, if it's not feeling good, only has its parents. Most of the time, one parent more than the other. So with children and babies, we see how needs can be very intense because they have a very limited number of resources. But even when we grow up, these dependency relationships are always parts of how we relate to people. If you're a therapist, you might see that this is actually a dominant way of relating for many people who seek therapy. But when we relate to people through dependency relationships, we don't actually see them as persons entirely. We see them as objects. We see them as resources to fulfill our needs. But we don't see them fully as persons. We see people fully as persons only when we have role relationships. Role relationships are those relationships, again, I will direct you back to the image, where two people actively try to understand each other. I construe you, you construe me, and then we can kind of understand how the other person sees the world. Again, this understanding is not necessarily just intellectual. Uh, Sometimes this is a gut feeling. Right? It can be an image, it can be all sorts of things, but it is not only intellectual. Some of it certainly is, but not all of it. Most relationships, ideally, are a combination of both. So even if you have established a good role relationship, let's say with your partner or your boss at work, there are still needs. You still might need comfort. You still might need job security and so on. So even in role relationships, dependency relationships persist. Only a role relationship allows us to negotiate our needs. It allows us to manage them in a more effective way. So two basic types of relationships, dependencies and role relationships. I already talked about anticipation, and I talked about our theory of knowledge. If you like science, you might find yourself reserved a little bit because you might think, well, this Vladimir fellow says it's not really a relativistic theory, but is it? Is it not really? So let me explain. The kind of relationship that constructivism has towards the world is exactly like science should have. In fact, Kelly explicitly says that the image of man, we call it the fundamental metaphor, is that of a scientist. Right? We see every person as a scientist because every person is testing hypotheses all the time. Right? When a client comes to therapy, they're testing the hypothesis that, let's say, they can be helped by a therapist. A therapist is behaving in a certain way because that's how the therapist imagines that they should behave as therapists, and then that will be either validated or invalidated by their clients. So it's kind of like a lab, and that goes for everything we do. And again, this metaphor, this idea that we always test hypotheses like scientists, is the idea is not that these are always conscious. Let's say when you flirt with someone, you will talk to that person, but the hypotheses you're actually testing, you're testing non-verbally. You're testing by projecting a certain body language with touch, with the way you look at the other person, the way you smile, how close or far away you stand. From our constructivist point of view, this is also your work as a personal scientist, right? You're testing something. I will come closer, and then I will test if the other person will stay, approach even more, or move away, right? Because that tells me something about how they see me physically, or whether they're attracted to me, and so on. So because we see everything as a choice, we see everything as testing a certain hypothesis. So whenever we see clients in therapy, for every little gesture, every little word, we can ask ourselves, what is this person testing? What's the hypothesis behind it? A hypothesis is perhaps a little sterile as a word, but think of it as meaning. These hypotheses that we have are really meaning that we have, is the meaning for situations. It's a meaning that we construct and then kind of act on. It's what certain situations mean to us. Constructivism is a theory that revolves around meaning fundamentally. Meaning is everywhere, right? We'll come back to that when we talk about, well, I always say we'll come back to that, and then I switch slides. Turns out that we're coming back to that right away. I wanted to say when we talk about constructs some more. So constructivism, constructs, what exactly are they, right? The definition that Kelly gives us is not a very useful one if you're not inclined to learn all the technical details of his theory. So he says that a construct is the way in which two things are similar while also being simultaneously different from a third thing. Right? It's kind of complex. So let's simplify. A construct is really a tool through which we create anticipations. We create constructs by perceiving recurring themes. Like if you experience, we started talking about rejection. Now I wish I had chosen a better example, but that's what happens when you don't prepare examples in advance. The first thing that pops into your mind may be related to a session you had yesterday, but it may not be the nicest example. But let's say that all your relationships end with you being hurt, right? So that's a recurring theme. So that's how constructs will be created. You look at patterns. And then what we do is we abstract these patterns into dichotomies, which we'll call constructs. So constructs always have two sides. They're bipolar. Again, it's a kind of a dialectic relationship, because to be happy means nothing if you don't have sadness on the other side, right? So happy, sad could be a construct for someone. Again, constructs are not verbal. Some constructs include words, so we can communicate them easily. Male, female, let's say, that would be a construct. In fact, critical theory and gender theory will often refer to the gender binary, because it's a construct, right? But just because we can name it like that and say, oh, here's the gender binary, it doesn't mean that the construct itself is verbal, because it's not. It's tremendously difficult, if not impossible, to actually define the binary entirely, right? So again, if we equate constraint with words, we will end up with a very cognitivist interpretation, and that completely abandons the spirit of Kelly's thinking. So as we go through our lives, right, we create these constructs, because constructs give us structure. They give meaning to the world. They allow us to anticipate and to find our way around, right? To know where to go, what to decide. Constructs can typically be public or private. An example of a public construct would be precisely the gender binary, for example, one of. But public constructs are given to us by our immediate environment. They're given to us by our culture. Sometimes, if you study sciences, you will start to see the world in scientific terms, right? So that's where some public constructs may come into play. They will often lose the initial context that they had. So, for example, nowadays people, especially people who read popular science, won't talk about moods. They'll talk about serotonin, or they won't talk about pleasure. They'll talk about dopamine. Personally, I find that to be incredibly reductive and also scientifically inaccurate if we're splitting hairs. But this is an example of how a scientific discipline can provide us with public constructs. Right? So personal constructs, as the other group, are those idiosyncratic constructs, like those very specific distinctions that our very special, unique circumstances gave birth to. So our identity, our psychological structure, is always a mix of both. As therapists, we emphasize private constructs a little more, right? So because we want to understand each individual person. And also because that's where the meaning of their life is. That's where the meaning of their symptoms is. Even so, basically our identity is a mix between public and private. Public constructs are like skeletons. They're like a house. They will say you have these, they'll give you, public constructs will give you instructions as to how tall your house can be, how many floors you can put there, how many rooms, what kind of electrical installations you need, and all these things. Like that would be public constructs. But specifically where your walls will be, or the kind of interior design you put into your house, is always a private choice. Right? So if you walk into someone's house, you hardly say, oh, what a lovely house, it's up to code. No, you usually say, oh, look, I like this sofa, or what a hideous painting you have on the wall there. So that's what we do as therapists. We walk into someone's house. It's very important for us to understand the public constructs, because they will tell us if the house is stable. They will tell us if the neighbors like the house or if they avoid it. It'll tell us more or less what we can expect, but the specifics, the beauty, the richness is always in individual interior design. It's about the art on the walls. It's about the I don't know, it's the color of your sofa and the color of your walls, and those are always private constructs. Constructs have elements, right? So those are words, sensations, images, memories of certain situations. All sorts of things can be elements of a construct. Depending on what the dominant elements are, we can distinguish between several types of constructs. So we have verbal constructs. Those are those constructs that we can easily articulate with words. And they're usually the constructs that we acquire later in life. And then we have nonverbal constructs, which are constructs that have other types of elements, intuitions, hints, gut feelings, memories, for example. And then as a subcategory of nonverbal constructs, we have preverbal constructs. Those are the oldest constructs we have. So those that we create before we can even speak. So these constructs usually exist as very strong intuitions, as body sensations. For example, early trauma will usually involve these constructs, which frequently results in people believing that they can't really explain themselves very well, because they will say all these words, throw them at you as a therapist, and then they will say, yeah, but you don't really understand me, because the pathology itself is preverbal. So those constructs often have to do with with integrity of our personality, with feeling safe, with these very basic fundamental distinctions. And then we have dependency constructs, which are, again, a subtype of preverbal constructs. And those are the constructs that I already mentioned that have to do with our basic needs. Right, so we have verbal, nonverbal, preverbal, and dependency constructs. There are many more types of constructs based on how we use these constructs, but that kind of goes beyond the scope of this lecture. So the important thing to understand here is that verbal constructs are different from nonverbal constructs only insofar as words are some of their elements. But the structure itself, the construct, is not anything, is always the same. If it's verbal or nonverbal or preverbal, the difference is just what types of elements we have there. In therapy, we usually start off with verbal constructs, but they're usually the last constructs we need to look at, because that which we can so clearly articulate and understand consciously, we can usually change that with a little nudge. But it's the nonverbal aspect of our personality that really requires work in psychotherapy. That's what our focus is always on. This is where constructivism, if we have to have this dichotomy between CBT and psychoanalysis, this is where we move more towards psychoanalysis than anything else. So we have all these constructs, but they don't just kind of randomly float around in our heads. In fact, to say that they float around in our heads is actually relying on a public construct, which is this mind-body distinction. And for us as constructivists, the mind-body distinction is really just a construct. And the mind-body problem is really just attempting to reconcile two distinct stories we tell about human beings. From a constructivist point of view, this division is arbitrary. If it's useful, we use it. If it's not useful, then we don't use it. So constructs, I'm digressing and I'm supposed to be concise and short, so go figure. So constructs are always organized, so they don't just lay around randomly. They form systems. These systems have vertical and horizontal organization. Not to get bogged down in those terms, just look at the image on the right. You have this prism, this actually pyramid shape. And this is how you can think of when you think of a system of constructs. They're always organized hierarchically. So at the top, you have something that we call core constructs. They govern all our psychological processes and basically form our sense of self, our identity. And then as you go down the pyramid, you have subordinate constructs. They're all entwined and connected, obviously. And they're kind of easier to change, and they're usually more concrete and more specific. But what's important to understand here is that even the constructs at the bottom of the pyramid link up all the way to the core constructs. So sometimes someone gives us, I don't know, someone looks at us funny and we explode with anger. That's because the funny look, which is a very specific, particular thing, goes all the way up to our core constructs and invalidates our identity, right? So something as small and seemingly insignificant, like a look in someone's eyes or a small gesture or some little word that people use semi-consciously, can go right from the bottom of the pyramid all the way to the top and produce a very intense reaction of threat, fear, anger, right? So when constructs link so quickly to the core, we call them regnant, but this is beyond the scope of the lecture. But that's just the point. What's at the top creates your identity. Everything else is subordinate to that. This pyramid, as you can see here, it has these lines that kind of seem like cracks. I suppose this is just a light, but let's go with it. I need them to be cracks to make the point that I'm making. So this pyramid has cracks, right? It still retains its integrity, but there are distinct bits and pieces of that pyramid that fit together. These are called fragments. Our systems are usually reasonably fragmented. This is where I said a second ago that we're kind of closer to psychoanalysis than we are to CBT, but when it comes to the idea of fragmentation, constructivism is somewhat different. We think of fragmentation as being an adaptive response. For example, what would be an example of fragmentation? I'm a therapist, but I also teach, and I also do have a private life from time to time. And in these different contexts, I will speak differently, use different examples, choose different words. I will have different things that I can or cannot say. As a therapist, I am very, like if someone tells me to go F myself as a therapist, I can't really respond in the same way. But as a private person, I can. As a therapist, my job is to think, okay, so this is very negative transference right now. What is the hypothesis that this person is testing? What are they trying to achieve? What did my words or my existence here with them, what does that mean to them? Right. So I have two distinctly different responses based on different contexts of my life. And for me not to be confused, my system is fragmented so that every context has delineated constructs. But they're all tied up at the top. As you can see, there are no cracks at the top here because the system is ultimately integrated. Okay, so how do we change this tightly wound mess, this system of constructs? Well, for one, for us, it's important to say change is inevitable. You really cannot go through life without changing. We sometimes resist change, but we still must change. Remember, the world is always changing. The universe is always in motion. So, of course, we must change our constructs because constructs that worked really well yesterday or 10 years ago may be entirely useless. You know, if we go back to that person who uses their early experiences of rejection to have this idea that every partner will ultimately reject them and abandon them, this is simply not a functional construct because it doesn't serve its purpose. It doesn't help the person form a safe, sustainable relationship if that's what they need, right? So psychotherapy doesn't really produce change so much as it accelerates it or directs it in a specific direction. Because even without therapy, life forces us to change. Whenever we have constructs that no longer work, we feel anxiety, we feel threat, we feel fear. And so these things are integral. They're a part of life. We can never get rid of them because as long as the world is in motion, our system of constructs will malfunction from time to time. So anxiety is always an invitation to be creative, right? This is, of course, not something that you can clearly explain to people who have anxiety disorders, and then they say, oh, gotcha, thanks, and then leave. It's a process. But from the standpoint of our theory, anxiety is something that we encounter all the time in life, like in existentialism. Existentialists have a very specific reverence for anxiety because, as unpleasant as it is, it's the purest contact we have with reality, right? When we find ourselves without functional constructs, it's an invitation to engage with the world. As Viktor Frankl would say, that's life asking us questions that we're supposed to come up with answers for. But in a more theoretical kind of way, we can talk about three types of change: contrast change or slot rattling. This is when we change from one side of the construct to the other side. This is a very drastic change. It's kind of like if Mother Teresa became a prostitute, that type of a change. You go from what's desirable to what's undesirable. So you change from one side of the construct to the other. So it's very drastic. It's something that people usually see when we change that way. People notice this and are often taken aback. But it's also the most superficial type of change because no new meaning is introduced into the system. You just flipped everything upside down. We have change, let's say, by displacement, when what was once at the periphery of the system now climbs up the pyramid and becomes its central focus. And then we have reconstructive change, which is the change that we as therapists, especially in what we call constructivist analysis, this long-term constructivist therapy, what we try to achieve, which is to take the constructs that you have and produce new ones, to alter them so that you have new meaning, so that the world is different for you, so that you are fundamentally different, not just to mix things up. When we talk about the speed of change, peripheral constructs, let me just go back to the previous slide. So peripheral constructs, those on the bottom of the pyramid, they change very easy. Like they're very, very simple to change. And sometimes when your clients start changing, that's where you will see even the biggest, most difficult change. This is where it'll start. Clients might change their hairstyles, the way they dress, the way they gesture, right? And that's kind of setting the stage for bigger change. The reason why they start there is because they're the easiest constructs to change. Core constructs, those on the top of the pyramid, they change very slowly. And whenever they're shaken up, we feel fear or threat. Threat is basically information that our identity must change if reality stays the way it is, right? So when core constructs change, they require an overhaul of the whole system, or at least the part of the system that is subordinate, that is under that core construct, right? Because when core constructs change, our identity, our sense of self changes. Thankfully, they change slowly. So we don't really feel like our existence is endangered every day. When we talk about emotions, so this is a very controversial topic. Some critics of constructivism read only the preface and not the whole 1,200-page book. So they will say, these constructivists, all they do is deal with thoughts. They treat people like machines. They're really cognitive theorists because they don't engage with human emotions. This is clearly false because you can't really have a personality theory that does not engage with the majority of our psychological lives. What we do have is, what did happen though, is that we kicked out the word emotions. In the beginning of the first volume of the Psychology of Personal Constructs, Kelly says that in this theory, he says there are no emotions, there's no motivation. He basically rejects the vocabulary of modern psychology. But we talk about guilt, threat, sadness, anxiety, all these things. We just call them transitions, not emotions. And the reason why we call them that way is because for us, emotions are really just information. Every emotion is a message about the state of our system of constructs. Anxiety is a message. It tells us you're facing a situation and you don't really have appropriate constructs for this situation. Threat tells us you're in danger, girl. all of who you are has to change. Guilt says you messed up. Guilt says guilt basically tells you that right now you are on the opposite pole of a core construct. So you're, instead of being a good person to be on the desirable end, you went to the other side. You lost your social identification for a moment there. You lost your identity. So guilt can tell us either be more disciplined, be mindful of your behavior, don't step outside of what your identity permits. Or we can say, listen, it's time to change identity. Because if your identity is causing you to feel guilt all the time, clearly does not give you enough space to accommodate your needs and who you really are. So then guilt tells us, change those constructs. They're hypothetical anyway. We just treat them as if they were real, right? So for us, emotions always accompany change. And because life equals change, that means that anxiety, that guilt, that threat, sadness, aggression, anger, all this is just a normal part of life. So if your idea coming to therapy is that you should never feel anxiety again, constructivism tells you, well, that's a nice delusion to have, but it really is a delusion, right? So we have to learn how to befriend our anxiety, not even just tolerate it, but befriend it, learn from it, because it is the information about ourselves. So emotions basically flow from the structure of our systems. They tell us where we have to change or what we have to add to our system of constructs. In PCP, diagnosis is really just a tool. So when we say people have social anxiety or people have borderline personality disorder or people have schizophrenia, for us, those are all hypothetical constructs. We really don't care that much for diagnosis, other than some kind of general information that they can give us, right? If a person comes to you and says, I was diagnosed with schizophrenia, you know that you and this person likely have some fundamental differences about what reality is, because this person's experience in some aspects of their life will be fundamentally different. But that is also true for many people we see as therapists. They're just not schizophrenic, right? So for us, it's a tool. Right? We don't like to put people in these little diagnostic boxes. Here's what Kelly says. It is forgivable to begin by describing the client to a colleague clinician as schizoid. But for the therapist to continue thinking of their client primarily as schizophrenic is unprofessional. So we are theoretically forbidden from reducing our clients to diagnoses. No client should continue to resemble a stereotype to the therapist they work with day after day. So that basically puts us in the category of these transdiagnostic approaches. You can work with any type of a complaint as a constructivist therapist because you're always looking at the personal constructs, at the person who's across from you. You're not looking at these socially constructed boxes that they're thrown in. A diagnosis is useful for a psychiatrist so that they can know what medication to prescribe. But a diagnosis tells you nothing about how your client experiences the world, what things mean to your client. Now, even if your client, let's say, hears voices, your job as a therapist is not to label your client, psychotic, bye-bye. No, your job is to understand, is that a male voice or is it a female voice? Is it a friendly voice? Is it disturbing? What is it like for your client when this voice emerges in their awareness? What choices do they have? How do they relate to this voice? How does this voice relate to the world? And so we always aim to understand the structure of personal experience. Kelly says the following. So we're content to allow disorder to mean whatever is ineffective from the client's perspective, from the therapist's perspective, from the perspective of oppressive neighbors, from the perspective of history, from the perspective of God. Perhaps a more important question is not what disorder is, but where the disorder is and what it seeks in treatment. Right? So we say, let that mean anything. We don't care for this label. We can use it colloquially. But when we hear, the word disorder, we always ask ourselves, what constructs in our client does this refer to? What kinds of constructs are they? How many of them are there? And so on. So basically, a disorder is any construct in the system that does not serve its function. It's very general, and it's wonderfully non-stigmatizing, because that means that from a constructivist standpoint, we all get disordered in life. It's kind of a part of living again, right? Some disorders are bigger, more comprehensive. They affect a person's life more, and so on. A symptom is always a function of the system of constructs. What does this mean? It means that a symptom is a choice, an unconscious choice 100% of the time, but still a choice that comes from a person's system of constructs, which means that no matter how strange, weird, intense, the symptom always has meaning within a person's system of constructs, which is always a reference point. So personal construct theory has a very flexible approach to psychotherapy, and it's suitable for both short-term and long-term therapy, depending on the type of change that needs to be achieved. Or rather, what is it that the client comes to you with? Like, what do they want to resolve? A constructivist therapist always plays an active role. What does this mean? Active doesn't mean assertive, doesn't mean aggressive. We don't necessarily have to interrupt our clients. We don't have to argue with them. We don't necessarily have to challenge their beliefs. On the other hand, we also don't have to be constantly silent, listen to their free associations, and look mystical while we do that. Right? So an active role means that as constructivists, we have to have the technical flexibility to approach every client strategically. Some clients, in certain parts of their treatment, might need us to be more engaging, more confrontational. Some other clients, or in different stages of the treatment, require us to be supportive. Sometimes our approach will require us to just listen and encourage our client to free associate. Sometimes we will offer interpretations, but then to some clients we will never will. So it's a very flexible approach. This flexibility is wonderful because it means that you can adjust your work to anyone, but it's also anxiety-inducing, especially if you're a young therapist. Because there's so much freedom that there is very little structure. You have to create your own structure. That brings us back to how we always choose and how we're always responsible for our choices. Constructivist therapists are required to know their own systems of constructs. We'll talk about transference and countertransference very soon. So that's one of the reasons why. But it's also so that they understand what they have at their disposal. If you're going to play an active role, you have to know what tools you have at any given moment, right? You have to know what topics you will have an easier time working with, what topics will require you to engage in a special way, what's out of your reach currently as a therapist. The principal task of every constructivist is to understand how phenomena appear in the consciousness of their clients. In other words, we map our clients' meanings and work on changing them. Right? So your job as a therapist primarily is to understand who is this person that I'm working with. As you're understanding it through your interaction with them, remember relational theory, your client is also clarifying who they are for themselves, as well as for you. Sometimes just this process of getting to know the client will change the client. I want to say a few words about transference and countertransference because they are central to our work as therapists. In a relational theory, you can't really escape transference and countertransference because no matter how controlled you are in terms of what you share, you're always relating to other people and they're always relating to you. So we cannot escape that. Everything we do is with transference. So a transference from a constructivist standpoint is all the ways in which the client construes the psychotherapist. So broadly speaking, we can distinguish between two types of transference, primary and secondary. Each have their own technical difficulties and solutions. Primary transference is usually very reductive. It's when a therapist or a partner or a coworker or your boss are like your mother and nothing else, or like your father and nothing else, right? It's kind of when you see one of those primary fundamental figures in the other person, and you kind of keep them in that box. Right? In therapy, this is a really big challenge, but that's again for some other lecture. Secondary transference is when you can say, ah, this person is like my father in this respect, but they also have this unique construct that's unique to them, or they're like me in some other respect. So it's a more complex, more integrated view of the other person. Countertransference, same thing, right? Only on the part of the therapist. So we can also preempt our clients and say, oh, this client is annoying as my mother. When we do that, we're not being good therapists and we have to snap out of it. The only countertransference that is acceptable to us is secondary, because then we don't forget that our client is actually a person, right? So in primary transference or countertransference, the person is an object, whereas in the secondary transference, we see them fully as a person and ourselves. Unlike in other theories where you can interpret transference and then be done with it, in constructivism, you never really get out of transference. Because remember, there is no objective view, there are only different perspectives. So as long as you have a perspective, you have transference of some kind. Transference is how your client's constructs work, where you are in their system of constructs. And they will always have constructs, so there will always be some kind of transference. In therapy, we want the kind of transference that allows us to produce the change we seek to produce. But we don't aim to interpret transference and then they will see us objectively forever. This is not our view. This is actually theoretically entirely impossible. Remember, you can't really go outside of all constructs and see people objectively. What people are is filtered through constructs. They are because we have certain constructs, and we are to them something specific because they have some constructs. Right? What does this mean for us as therapists? This is very important for countertransference. It means that we always have to do the work of understanding our own system of constructs. Right? We have to be reasonably conscious of our system so that we can understand how it interacts with our clients, so that we don't cross some boundaries that we must never cross. Right? And so that we know at any given moment, am I looking at this person through the lens of my professional constructs, my professional role, or am I looking at them as a private citizen and judging them from that point of view? Right? Because that's not useful for therapy. So we want to eliminate that. And the only way for us to know what part of our system of constructs we're sitting in currently is if we actually have a good awareness of our system of constructs. So in didactic psychotherapy, when you're learning to become a therapist, you go to therapy the whole time, at least in constructivism. The goal of didactic therapy is to make you aware. Right? So it's a very it's a difficult process in the sense that it brings out the worst, like those parts of your system of constructs that you don't like to enjoy even acknowledging as existing within, right? Because those are the parts that will damage our work with our clients. So those are the parts that we have to understand and accept. In constructivism, we are never allowed to judge our clients, and that also means that we can't really judge ourselves either, because relationality, remember. I want to say a few words about resistance, and then we can slowly bring this lecture to its end. So although resistance is an obstacle in therapy, right? It can slow down therapy. It can take us on different kinds of detours or completely bring the process to a halt. We see resistance not as something, not as an obstacle, like I said. It can be that, but that is not our primary perspective. We see it from our client's point of view, like from the shoes of our clients, not the therapist. Like I can see it as an obstacle, but then I'm making a mistake of thinking that this process, this therapy is about me, and it's not. It's about the client. As always, we ask ourselves, what is this scientist across from me testing now? So Uh, we can think of resistance as our failure as therapists. It could be that we're not understanding a part of our client, but that instead we're really just kind of imposing our own fantasy about what the problem is. When you impose meaning on another person, the person resists, right? So when we encounter resistance, it could be that we're trying to force something on our clients that's not actually there for them, that they don't like, that has no place in their life. This doesn't mean, oh, this therapist is saying something unpleasant to me. Not at all. It means that we're misunderstanding their constructs, right? That's one way to look at it. And this is something that every therapist must go to first. How did I misconstrue my client? When did I leave role relationships with my client? I need to go back and understand. But resistance can also happen when we understand our clients perfectly well as therapists. So we know what their constructs are, we know how they operate, but there's still resistance. In that case, we see resistance as a defensive maneuver. So it's not that the client doesn't want to change. Otherwise, they wouldn't bother coming to therapy. It's that they're defending themselves because that part of their psychological structure is vital and they don't have an alternative. No one is going to give up the only thing that gives meaning to their lives, because without meaning, we have horrifying anxiety. We lose ourselves. So, of course, when that is threatened, even when the therapist is accurate and precise, if that is threatened, we're going to defend ourselves. So resistance is not that we don't want to change, it's that we simply have to make some other structural accommodations first. So if that's why our clients are resisting change, the invitation is to understand the system more comprehensively and then make appropriate structural accommodations so that the client doesn't feel like they're going to fall apart in a million different pieces. Of course, we have to be very realistic. Therapy is difficult, so it never gets easy. But there's a difference between this is exceedingly difficult and I will fall apart and go insane if we continue down this path. Right, the latter is clearly requires structural accommodations. In early constructivist literature in Serbian, of all things, there is a word upor. Upor can be is a really nice, almost like a word play on the word resistance, because resistance is otpor, right? So instead of, well, let's not get into a quick Serbian lesson. Let me just say that this word translates as persistence. And that was actually a very good way to describe resistance. But then the word kind of got lost because the dominant kind of therapeutic establishment uses the word resistance. We all use that word. So the word persistence was changed with the word resistance. But maybe persistence describes more accurately what we see as resistance in constructivism. So the clients are not resisting change. They're just persisting in the use of the only psychological structure they have. And remember, even the clunkiest, most dysfunctional, worst structure you can imagine is better than no structure at all. Because without structure, we only have this intense, incomprehensible anxiety. So, in short term therapy, we aim to remove the client's complaint. Someone comes because they have panic attacks. The goal of our therapy is clearly for them not to have panic attacks. That's very simple. And there's really not much to say there. Once that goal is achieved, you may want to work on another goal or end therapy, or you may make detours along the way and create new goals, but that would be what short-term therapy does. Personally, while I am capable of doing short structured therapy, and I do it, it is not my preference. For some therapists, it is. It is not my preference. I really like to work on what we call constructivist analysis, which is this long-term reconstructive therapy, because I really like to help people fundamentally resolve things. I like therapy that produces reconstruction, the change of those core constructs. I like people to create new worlds for themselves. It's a fulfilling, intense process. where you truly become invested in a very different way in your client's journey. So the complaint is always defined on a phenomenological level. So we never say, well, your complaint is borderline personality disorder. No. If the client comes to therapy and they say, well, I have this fear of abandonment and all my relationships end up with me being heartbroken and left alone, then that's the complaint we work with. We don't need to reach for DSM or ICD and use those diagnostic terms. In fact, from the point of view of constructivist therapy, as you saw from Kelly's quote, that's disrespectful, and it's also a technical error because our clients are not diagnoses. Long term. So, if we start this kind of long term process, how do we know that it ends? I had a conversation once with a friend of mine who's a psychoanalyst, and she said, "Well, psychoanalysis fundamentally, truly, really ends when the client no longer feels the need to see me." And that does make a lot of sense to me. However, there are clients with separation issues who might not ever really put those issues on the table. And we as constructivists cannot really impose topics onto them, right? So we have to have some kind of some kind of criteria that will tell us if we're moving in the right direction. And we have to have this image of when can we say that our work as therapists is done. The therapy can go on, of course, if the client wants us, but the client no longer needs us, and that's a big difference. So what we say is that we can say that the therapy concludes when we constitute what's called a constructivist subject. The constructivist subject is not defined by any specific content. There are no beliefs that you're supposed to hold to successfully finish therapy. Like it's an empty term in the sense in which irony is negative, as Kierkegaard talks about it. It's a designation of how our processes unfold, not what these processes are. So there are three basic things that we can notice, and then we say this person has achieved a constructivist subjectivity. Let's say that they're reflexive, meaning that they understand their own constructs and their own processes. They're able to notice their constructs, put them into words, understand what they mean, right? So it's learning how to do structured introspection. It's not something you can teach someone. It's something that truly comes about as a result of this kind of authentic, unique relationship that we have with our clients. The second thing is metastability. Because we live in a world that always changes, and because our psyche is always dynamic, we never actually reach a place where you have no complaints, no conflicts, nothing to talk about. Unless you're, I don't know, a monk in Nepal in some cave for 35 years. As long as you interact with other people, you will have paradoxes, conflicts, frustrations, and so on. Metastability is this state of mind where we are able to remain poised and attain a kind of equanimity, I guess, kind of accepting this this idea that yes, we have conflicts, but these conflicts don't really shake us up fundamentally because we know that they're inevitable. Even if they're not here now, we know that they will be at some point. But it's not just knowing that, because we can know that and still freak out. It's knowing that, but really understanding that when such things appear, you will have the agency to make appropriate choices for yourself. It's kind of retaining equanimity in the face of this world that is always open, always anxiety-inducing, always unstable. And the third thing is what I just said, which is to accept uncertainty or ignorance. This doesn't mean that we, say that we know nothing, because clearly we know many things. It's kind of to accept that all our knowledge is hypothetical, right? That there are no guarantees in life, that just because things seem clear and predictable, and because you feel like you really know your life and yourself, we know that this is never entirely true. So we accept that living means embracing anxiety and means embracing change. These are very tall orders. So that's why I emphasize long-term therapy goals, not short-term therapy goals. But once a person truly kind of embodies this, you know that they will be fine. You know that they're equipped to carry the responsibility that is being alive and being free. And I will stop here. Thank you for this allegedly short introduction. I have no idea how long I've been talking, but hopefully it was not too long.